Good evening, Europe, and welcome to Green Screen. I'm your host, Sam Murray, and over the next few months, we will be bringing you a wide range of online film screenings and invite you to join our debates on the future of Europe, post-COVID recovery, and making our society more resilient and sustainable. Tonight's theme for the debate is Fighting for Change, why the rule of law is critical to uphold democracies. As we evolve out of the pandemic, society is beginning to adapt and change to respond to a challenge to our humanity and how we function as a society. At the heart of most responses to the pandemic has been an empathy and humanity towards the people around us, at times requiring us to make great sacrifice to act to protect others and not merely ourselves. It is this humanity we constantly evolve that allows us to progress as a society and to recognize the need to support and offer protection to others. We have learned now more than ever that to tackle the great challenges that humanity faces, we must take collective action. In taking collective action, we often rely on the democratic structures of government that lead us, and we hope that our elected officials respond to such active collective desires that we have for change. But the pandemic has sadly also exposed within some governments a tendency to not only think that they know best, but to disconnect themselves from wider society, creating divisions where rule of law is applied to citizens, but those in government are somehow exempt from rules or above the law. And sometimes this has led to a removal of democratic means for change and the disruption and destruction of civil society. Democracy and rule of law is not about enforcing a control on society, but rather creating a space for society to evolve and to ensure that human rights are respected as a fundamental basis for such an evolution. And we need citizens' voices to be empowered and mechanisms for change. And this week's movie really gets to the heart to demonstrating what is possible. So today's film, and the film that we've been looking at, is called The Eighth, which is a remarkable documentary documenting the story of the campaign around repealing the Eighth Amendment around abortion in Ireland. And we'll go into a bit of detail about the film later. But this film is really part of and comes to the heart of our Green Screen project. And now I would like to invite our Secretary General, Mar Garcia, to come and join us to tell us a little bit more about this particular project and to give us more of an idea of why today's film was chosen. So first of all, a big hello and welcome to you, Mar. How are you doing today?
Hello, Sam. I'm doing well. Thank you. Very excited today about this film. So this debate is very special for me.
So I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about the Green Screen project and what are the kind of general aims and ideas you had around creating it?
Yeah, so I mean, the Green Screen is one of the sweetest projects that we are doing from the EGP. We are a political party, and of course, we want to do politics, to talk politics, to act. The Green Film is an idea that emerged during COVID, and as we thought COVID was going out, because one of the greatest sectors that was hit by the pandemic was the cultural one. So we said, how can we support also this cultural sector while doing politics? Then we had this idea of screening relevant films and then have a conversation, a political conversation around them. So voila, that's where it comes from.
So obviously today's topic is looking at rule of law, and I just wondered what thoughts that you have about, the state of rule of law in Europe and why we need to have this debate and conversation today.
Well, I mean, let me just, before that, remind everybody the green screen happens every Thursday. So the Wednesday and the Thursday, you can watch the film for free all over Europe. And then you are welcome to also join us on the debate on the third Thursday of the month. So voila. But rule of law, well, it's obviously lately a very recurrent word. So it's used here and there, especially the European Greens is organizing their next assembly, their next council, and we're going to Budapest. And when you mention Hungary, there is also this rule of law question that pops up because of its current government, not because of the Hungarian, rather because of the current government. So well, I mean, for me, the rule of law is a basic, a very fundamental topic when we speak about democracies, when we talk about democracies, when we think about democracies, because it's actually the framework, the legal framework in which our democracies happen, yeah? So if we don't preserve, when we talk about preserving the democracy, taking care about the democracy, we also need to understand that, this framework, the rule of law, is what allows democracies to happen, to actually become real things, yeah, guaranteeing our rights. So those are the framework of our rights, guaranteeing our services and stuff. So and this film is a very special one because it changes the legal framework in Ireland. So this is about modifying the law and then giving rights to the women. So we thought this film was a very nice way of talking and explaining sometimes this concept that feels a bit far away, the rule of law. So we thought that was a good opportunity. And I'm very happy and excited about the speakers that we will have tonight, because I'm sure that I'm going to enjoy very much the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time as always, Mar. And you can definitely still screen the film. Obviously, watch our debate first, but you can log in and watch the film through the Green Screen website, and we will be sharing the details for this in the chat already that you might be able to see. So do check the film out before it leaves and come and join us on our debates on the third Thursday of every month. So thank you very much, Mar, for joining us.
Take care.
So to set the tone for today's discussion, we're going to start with our artistic pill. And this week it focuses on the work of Polish artist Karol Radziewski, who uses his work to explore queer histories that have existed in Poland but have been rarely spoken about. And at a time when LGBTIQA plus people are being systematically oppressed in Poland, work of artists like Karol has become vital in giving voice to those under attack and telling their stories. So let's now have a look at this week's artistic pill.
My name is Karol Radziewski. I'm a Polish visual artist based in Warsaw, working with film, photography and painting. In 2005, I made the first open gay exhibition in Poland called Facts, and since that moment I work a lot on my identity and in many projects addressing the queer issues. So in Poland, conservatives, right-wing politicians are using history as a weapon, as a tool, also to targeting LGBT people, saying we never exist, there is something that came from the West. So I decided to do something completely opposite, using the history as our tool to tell the real story from our queer perspective. Slowly I started to introducing figures from the past, gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary people, writers, culture figures, politicians, even Polish kings, that I summarize in a painting series called Portrait, which is the gallery of portraits. Last year, the activist riots and especially the detention of Margot, the non-binary activist, inspired me to portray the contemporary activist part of our community. Here you can see the portrait of Margot that I painted just after her detention, or the Milo, the trans activist that committed suicide, to represent them with the paintings and also to use this tool to help the community. The portrait of Margot as a reproduction, as a poster, was sold for people to collect money for the LGBT organizations. All these paintings were, of course, hung in the museums, galleries, and bought by the collectors, but in the same time I realized that by reproduction, by the way that people are sharing, the community started to use them on the social media, and how this painting started to function in the public space become really inspiring and important. And I went even farther, so I thought, why not to go with the painting on the street, especially like what's happened with the women's strikes. Last year, massive strikes to support women's rights after the abortion ban in Poland, where on the streets there was a big need to support each other, the minority groups. And then I just painted the slogan like "Facts with Women" and with the symbol of women's strike, and just went to the street on the protest directly. Later on, this painting became also a banner, part of the exhibition, very political one, organized in Lublin with all the protesters and activists. And I thought that, actually this classic medium of painting, it's doing the job, it's political.
It was such a remarkable artistic spot to look at this week, and you can find out more about Carol's work on the Green Screen website if you're interested to find out more. So I'm now going to introduce today's panelists, and we are so excited to have this wonderful combination of expertise across all of our different areas of discussion today. And I just first of all want to introduce somebody who you may have seen from the film this week, to introduce Alva Smith, who is a campaigner and co-director of the Together for Yes campaign. Good evening, Alva. How are you today? Oh, I think you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Not for the first time on mute. Very delighted to be here, and what a great project the Green Screen is. So very proud and delighted and pleased to be here with these other great, wonderful people.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you as well, Alva. Thank you very much. We also have joining us Mina Jack-Tolo, who is the International Officer for APDP, apologies, got to get that right, who are the Maltese Green Party. Welcome, Mina Jack. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much. It's actually really, really interesting to be invited to talk on a debate about the rule of law. Usually invited to talk about feminist issues or LGBT issues. So this is really refreshing. Thank you.
We are so glad to have you with us. Thank you very much, Mina Jack. Next, we have Dr. Raphael Bosong, who is a researcher and senior associate at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. Welcome, Raphael. How are you this evening? Unfortunately, I don't think we can hear you at the moment. So
okay, I think that might have been the headset issue. Now, can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, we can hear you.
Probably better without headset, sorry. Well, thank you for having me, and well done on the German there. So, yeah, it's also very interesting for me to be here, coming from a rather different background, but hopefully also offering something on your today's debate. And it's always very good to also not just have it dry, but also in this artistic sense as you're doing it today. Thank you.
We are so glad to have you with us as well, Raphael. Thank you for joining. And finally, I want to welcome somebody who has been working a lot on the subject of rule of law and really at the forefront of dealing with a lot of countries who are unfortunately not committing to European values and not upholding the rights that we would expect. And her work has perhaps become more important now more than ever. And I'd like to welcome Gwendolyn Delbos-Caulfield MEP, who is a member of the Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights Monitoring Group. Welcome, Gwendolyn. It's a pleasure to have you join us this evening.
Thank you. Happy to be here too.
Thank you. So we're going to get into our debate in a second, but before we do, we're going to be showing you a trailer from this week's film. This week's film is called The Eighth, and it traces Ireland's campaign to remove the Eighth Amendment, which was a constitutional ban on abortion. And it shows a country's transformation from a conservative state in thrall to the Catholic Church to a more liberal, secular society. So before we begin our discussion today, let's have a look at the trailer of the film, which you can still go and watch. Definitely go and watch it afterwards. And you can access it through our website, thegreenscreen.eu. So now let's have a look at the trailer.
On Friday, voters will go to the polls to decide on whether to remove or to keep the Eighth Amendment from our Constitution.
Order! Can you not see it? Order!
This was the most
historically divisive issue in Ireland ever.
We've waited 35 years, just 1 week to do it, and we're going to bring it home. Women are still travelling, women are still in danger.
This government needs to protect women's lives.
We absolutely have to do something.
What they're trying to do is take God out of society.
Sadly, the answer is we'll just get rid of it instead of what do you need?
There was that sense that women couldn't be trusted.
Well, I think the women of Ireland have rolled over for long enough.
Why can't I love glitz and glamour and still feel passionately about women's rights? Imagine if you could get this army of women putting that pressure on and to feel empowered.
Something magical happened where it became a symbol of women's equality in Ireland.
All these stories being somehow set free of to try and change the country.
It's actually about the value that we're putting on women in Irish society.
People do recognise it's a kind of a backlash. What happens here in Ireland will have a knock-on effect.
We are creating an Ireland which values women, our bodies, our choices, ourselves, our lives, absolutely equally.
So this is definitely a film that you should not miss, and as soon as today's discussion and debate finishes, if you haven't seen it already, please do. We've already had comments in about the movie. We've had a comment from Esmeralda Hoja, who said that they loved the movie and congratulations are the best from Albania. So it's really nice to see that this movie has already reached out and spoken to a lot of people. So we've been running a few social media polls this week, and we've just got a few little thoughts and ideas that have come in from various people who've engaged with social media before we delve into our debate. What was really interesting is whilst the social media was guided to asking questions such as what does feminism mean to you, and how people have engaged with this particular topic of abortion in the referendum. Quite interestingly, in those discussions and the answers that we've had, people have really identified not only women's rights, but equality and protecting democracy as connected to each other and being really, really important to how we view society. And that if we are making changes that are in line with feminism, at the core is really this idea of protecting the rule of law and ensuring the frameworks are there for this change to happen. So the first topic that we're going to be discussing tonight with Gwendolyn and Raphael is going to be this topic of protecting the rule of law, and really trying to ask, how do we protect it in Europe, and how do we ensure that democracy can thrive and that citizens can actually be empowered to make change. So Raphael, I would like to come to you first, and I wonder if you could offer us some thoughts from the various pieces of research that you've been doing. What do you think the state is of democracy in Europe at the moment?
Well, it's certainly not as good as we've hoped to, and we've had this kind of period of so-called backsliding, but not to kind of engage in hair splitting. But I think it's also important to come right to the core that democracy and the rule of law are not one of the same thing. And I'm not trying to make it confusing here, but I think we also need to know that those countries that we see as problematic, and of course, it's not a surprise that we mostly look at Hungary and Poland, but there are others which have their own problems. But, those two countries are at the forefront, and for good reasons. A lot of indicators show that they have a declining quality of both the rule of law and democracy. But those countries are saying they are democracies because they are, supposedly enacting the will of the majority that brought these governments into power. So I think we really need to be clear to say that democracy, yes, democracy is powerful, we want it, but at the same time, we live in a sort of framework where democracy also doesn't mean the untrammeled rule of the majority to do whatever they want to, and equality before the law and respect for institutions, that really what matters just as much. So overall, I wouldn't say we're in a terminal crisis, and sometimes people are extremely alarmist. No, Europe is still a bastion, and overall, in the longer scheme, say the last 50 years, we live in a good time. Yet the last 5 to 10 years have been a serious test that we don't trust anymore at this story of progress, and we really have to defend the achievements that we've seen previously. So it's not something to be taken for granted.
And I think you raised a really, really important point there about the fact that a lot of these particular countries who are having issues with democracy and rule of law try and pass off that it's a majority who have this particular opinion and state of mind. But what this supposed majority also do is ignore any other voices in the room. And this has particularly impacted women's rights, has particularly impacted those with protected characteristics, those with disabilities, LGBTIQA plus people as well. And I think that it's quite telling that this particular pattern has occurred. So thank you for kind of setting the scene for us, Raphael. And I think there's some really important reflections we could have in there. Gwendolyn, I'd like to bring you in next. I mean, obviously, in your varied work across many areas of the European Parliament, you really have first-hand experience to see those challenges to democracy and rule of law that Raphael has talked about, particularly in Hungary and Poland. And obviously, quite a few people will know of your work in those particular countries and areas. And I wonder whether you think it's a case that in these particular countries, they're saying on the one hand that they are respecting the majority of the people and these European values, whilst on the other, they're really acting against the interest of various different groups. And I wonder, through reflecting on your role in the European Parliament, if you could tell us what do you think the role is of the EU in protecting rule of law, safeguarding democracy, and intervening in these particular situations that Raphael has described?
Yes. Well, first, I want to add something to what Raphael said. I completely agree. In the European Parliament, you said the name of the specific working group I'm in. We always put together rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights, because indeed these three ideas are not exactly the same, and what we defend in the European Parliament and in a majority, we have strong majority for that, is indeed to defend democracies, but also rule of law, which means an independent justice, a pluralism of media, access to a plurality of information, a certain number of possibilities for counterpowers, so democracy doesn't stop the night of the vote. When indeed a majority has been found, it goes on the years after, because you have to have balanced powers in the country. And then third thing, this idea of fundamental rights and the idea that everyone is entitled to have rights and liberties, not only those that are in the majority that voted the government. And the second thing I want to add, so I do address, as Raphael said, the differences, but also it is important to say that today in Hungary and Poland, we do not know where the majority lies. It is not true to say that Orbán and Fidesz in Hungary and peace in Poland is still the majority. We do not know that, because the capturation of the power means that today it's very difficult to know what the people really want. In Hungary, it's even stronger than in Poland, but in Hungary, there is no more place for dissident voices anywhere. So that means that the majority, we don't know where it is. And this is very important because in Poland, for example, the huge demonstrations at various occasions and the polls show that people, for example, are very, very interested by European values, and they want the same guarantees as everyone. So that's the first thing. What we can do is to recall that all the time. Recall the rules. We have a framework in European Union. This framework is that you need independence of justice, that you need counterpowers, and that you need media pluralism. So that are rules, and if these countries do not obey these rules, they should have sanctions. It's quite simple. And these sanctions, they exist in a number of places. If a country tomorrow doesn't obey the rules of the unique market, of the market zone, it will have sanctions. So why do you have sanctions if you do something that is not good on a money aspect or commercial aspect as a country, and then you have no sanctions if you break a number of rules. So there are things that we can do, sanctions, and then there's the symbolic fight. European Union is the European Parliament and with us most of the time Commission, sometimes sadly not enough the Council, but the structures and most of all the members of Parliament, we are there to say more and more and again that we are here to defend the rights of everyone, the vulnerable ones, of course, women, gender issues in general, and to recall that the European Union is a territory where the rights of all of these people are equal and need to be respected.
Thank you very much, Gwendolyn. I think quite often, as you say, that the sanctions that we see are perhaps not strong enough, and a lot of citizens probably across Europe are asking, for example, why is the EU still funding programs in these countries where they are not respecting those particular values? And I know those discussions are ongoing. So, Raphael, I wonder if I can come to you next, and I wonder if I could ask you that, learning from the experiences of how governments across Europe have dealt with particularly the pandemic, how do you think that we could ensure that democracy and rule of law are upheld within the EU and across Europe? And also invite you to obviously comment on anything that Gwendolyn has also said.
It is a really challenging task. And I think there is two things fundamentally we should remind ourselves of. The first thing is, however much we believe in the European Union and it has a role, we do have to also accept that change has to come from within. And I think it's also something that very clearly comes from the film that we saw, that in the end, ultimately, there has to be a bottom-up mobilization. And it's not something that can be just done from the outside. And you need to have patience for that as well. So I don't want to condone or just pass over negative developments that are happening there. But I think we're also not doing ourselves a favor if we're expecting change tomorrow. And I mean, again, it's not to say it's fine what happened in the last 4 or 5 years in Poland or so, but it is a generational task. And in Ireland it's different, in Germany has been different, and in those countries it's different. So that's the first thing that we need to understand. On the other hand, of course, yes, we live in a union, we live in the EU as we have EU citizenship, and I think it's also just a matter of making clear that governments can't just act not only in their own countries but in the union as they please. And sanctions, yes, maybe that's one way. I think the other question, though, is as well, how can we, how should I say, make it clear that for these countries, there is a way to go, with their own values to some extent, to have their own sort of political projects, keep some dialogue, but at the same time say, okay, really, you have a diverse population, and you have to respect the clubs of the rules. I don't think that sanctions are the only way to do that. I think it's also a question of defining alternative ways of, say, having a common project. And say, for example, okay, peace is not the best partner there, but if you want to talk about the future and say the green transformation, energy transformation, things like that, I would seriously hope that we also find a common ground there. It's very difficult. But we need both arms. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes, we need to have sanctions. Yes, we need to have clear lines. But we also shouldn't give up on trying to build some common projects, even if we have difficult partners there. I know that sounds maybe a little bit wishy-washy, but I don't think we can do it otherwise, honestly.
And I think you raise a very, very important point, that it becomes incredibly easy, doesn't it, to immediately go in on countries that are having a very negative experience when there are obviously some really positive examples. And I really think this week's film demonstrates, an upholding of rule of law, allowance for change, allowance for the development in society. And I think it's important, as you say, to not only look at ways such as sanctions to address this, but to look at those positive dialogues, how you can create those kinds of projects that can really help through them educate and change particular perspectives and opinions as well. So thank you for those thoughts. I think they're really useful, Raphael. And Gwendolyn, if I can turn to you next on the similar lines of this question. What do you think the lessons are that we could learn from the pandemic about the importance of upholding the rule of law in Europe? And do you think to some degree we could actually take democracy for granted?
I will start by reacting to something that Rafael said, and then I will go to your question, of course. And anyway, there are things that will answer also your question. I wanted to say that one of our big job is to support these parts of the societies that are fighting. Indeed, these women in fights, the LGBT communities that are very, very attacked, and all of this, journalists, judges, and all this. So this role of support is as important, and of dialogue is as important as the role of sanctions, for sure. Second thing is to say that indeed the change will come from inside. That is for sure. I completely agree with Rafael about this, and this is what the film shows about Ireland. But what allowed in Ireland this, and I think that the film shows it very well, is that it was a real, vivid, huge, incredible moment of dialogue and collective debate in a society. In fact, I think it's quite fascinating. I think this historical moment in Ireland has not been looked upon enough, and researches have not been made enough, because we haven't lived this in a number of our member states for a long time. This referendum was not only about the referendum, it was a huge moment of discussion on how do we live together, what place we give to each other, what place has history as church. It brought up all sorts of other debates also, of course, because history of the church, for example, came up, and all of this. So this vivid moment of debate in the society, the problem is that at the moment it's not possible in Poland and Hungary. So I completely agree on the fact that changes need to come from inside, but sometimes also it's not easy to do it because of the situation. And then the change inside will not be enough. Why am I saying that? Because the big fight that we have, anxiety we have in Hungary, for example, today, is that indeed the opposition, they managed to get all together. They have one candidate they could win in April against Viktor Orban. But what Orban has done is a second state in the state. He has put up foundations that are opaque. He has put people everywhere of his own surrounding, and these people will stay on even in the next years. And that's where European Union can be also next to the fight inside a tool, because we have to say that some of these things are not possible. And because that has been done with the European money. That's the cynical situation, that the corruption allowed these people to take the captation of the power. So it's a mix of fighting inside and us on the European side having these sanctions, and both will act together. And to answer your question, Poland and Hungary used the pandemic to put some parts of society one against the others. They really went after the vulnerable people, all these what we call minorities, all the people that were not in the conservative world. But to be honest, the pandemic was used in all member states of European Union to reduce rights and democracies. Most of the time, it was on good purpose, and it was done in a reasonable way. But in most of the countries, they went too far. The first thing of everywhere closing the borders was a huge problem. So indeed, I think the pandemic really alerted us all that this is no, of course, democracy is not guaranteed. Never. Like women's rights are never guaranteed. I mean, what's interesting in this moment of history in European Union is the difference between Poland and Ireland. Poland was one of the first European Union countries, it wasn't in European Union at the time, but European countries to be very, very open on abortion at the time of the communism. And they've gone all the way back on the other side. And Ireland has done exactly the same. So our rights are never guaranteed, our democracy are never guaranteed, and this is only done because you keep the democratic debate vivid. If you manage that, then you can go through bad periods and come back and all of this. But if you cut the debate in the society, that's when you become very vulnerable to an authoritarian moment.
I think there's a lot of very sobering thoughts to certainly reflect on there. Thank you very much, Gwendolyn. And I think also democracy in action is beautiful to see when citizens do engage with it passionately, and there is, as you say, a vivid debate. And we're now just going to watch a short clip from our film, This Week the 8th. in which we're going to see and hear about where the participants of this particular referendum felt that real debates were happening during democratic exercises such as referenda. So we're now going to have a look at this particular clip. Enjoy.
Those constructs of debates are not where the real debate is going to be happening around the country. The real debate is actually going to be happening between people. It's going to be happening, you know, at dinner tables, in the pub, in the church. Like, we know that people have really diverse views on abortions, that they are very nuanced. And just because a lot of the media doesn't take a lot of time to portray that does not mean that that's not where people are at.
You know what, we're going to start over here and come back up along.
Canvassing season. This is the most important part of the campaign, in my opinion, in terms of getting out there and going door to door. What are your concerns about canvassing, Andrea?
Well, I've never done it. It can feel difficult to cross that line for the first time.
Well, you're waiting there, a little bit of reading for you. Thanks very much.
It's my choice, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to vote.
Yes.
No. I was given the opportunity to live, and I will give anybody else I can give the opportunity to live.
To live, yeah.
I wish to God the politicians would keep themselves the hell out of people's bedrooms and the church as well.
Absolutely.
You know, it's nothing to do with them.
Couldn't agree with you more.
It's a damn disgrace.
An absolute disgrace.
I'm guaranteeing you right now, once you do it, you'll realise that it actually isn't scary at all.
So I'm now going to invite Alva and Mina Jack to come into the screen to come and join us in this particular discussion. And as you can see from that particular clip, I think it's very clear what joy it can be from having such vivid debates, although they may be on difficult subject matters as well. So I'm just going to let our tech team allow Alva and Mina Jack to come in and join us on the screen. And then whilst that is happening, so hopefully they will appear in a second. I'm sure the magic is working. We are getting them in. Brilliant. There we go. Hi, Alva and Mina Jack.
Hi.
And before we come to the next part of the discussion, I just want to share some of the comments that have come in already about the film. The film has really struck in a wonderful chord with our audience. And the first comment we have is from Biljana Lalic. I think this is going to appear on the screen very shortly. But Biljana's left us the thought that they felt it was an absolutely amazing documentary with such an inspiring message and a love heart to share there. We've also got a comment from Anna Rabus, who I think this will appear on the screen shortly, saying it was an amazing story and amazing documentary. And I think there was some kind of emoji here, the wash hands emoji, which I think means it's a good thing. I need to get with my emojis. I'm not down with the kids on this one. But also some very exciting news as well. We have the director of the film is also joining us. Aideen Kane is tuning in, listening in live from New York. And they've also left with us a lovely message just to thank Mara and the team at European Greens for their kind words about the film and say that we are so honoured to be part of this screening series as well. So it's really wonderful to see how this particular film has struck a chord. So definitely keep your comments and your questions coming in. I can see they're coming in the chat as well. Oh, just to apologise, Aideen has corrected me. Aideen is a co-director of this particular film. And I might ask Aideen if you can pop in the chat if you can hear me who the other co-director is, just because I don't have the information in front of me. Or perhaps, I don't know if Elva knows, you can share that.
Yes.
Yes. So we're now going to change a bit of tact and think about, once we've got democracy and rule of law kind of established, how do we, within these frameworks, go about and make change? And with democracy and rule of law protected, and upheld, citizens can engage with developing society and making change as we advance in our understanding of humanity and the rights we hold as citizens in the world. So in this section of the debate, we're going to try and answer this question of how is it really possible. So if I can come to you first on this particular topic, Alva, and ask from your experience in campaigning, not only for the abortion referendum, I think I'm right in saying you were also involved in the campaign around equal marriage as well. How do you think citizens can make changes to the law to really promote these human rights and these shared common values?
Well, you know, first of all, it's lovely to see the comments coming in. And can I just say there were three brilliant directors of this film, Aideen, who has already popped up, and also Maeve O'Boyle and Lucy Kennedy. And that actually the Together for Yes campaign was led by three organisations and therefore three women leaders, which the media found very difficult to understand, how a campaign could be led by not just one woman, but by three, and that it could be so immensely successful. So I think that tells us a lot about also the nature of our democracy, which is still very gendered as well as very ethnicized and raced and so on and so forth. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot to talk about this evening, but I would say from my vantage point as a campaigner, that unless the people rise and actually push our legislator from time to time to expand our understanding of democracy, to expand our understanding of freedom, to understand and expand our needs in terms of our basic rights and freedoms, unless the people rise and do that, and we can do that, of course, through elections, but we also do that through what I think Raphael very rightly calls strong bottom-up mobilization. Unless we do that, what we end up with is some kind of static, non-changing, non-evolving rule of law or state or status or whatever you like, which does not correspond to the needs of people. So of course, you know, you can't divorce one from the other. The rule of law is there as the will of the people and also to serve the people. It is not just some kind of abstraction. And one of the worries and anxieties that I think many of us can have is that when it becomes some kind of abstraction, when it becomes divorced from the material realities of people's lives, at that point, it is really effectively redundant. Well, it's obsolete, it's not working. And in our case in Ireland, it was perfectly clear that there were so many rights, and there still are, let me say, that need to be inscribed in our laws, are provided for legally, that we have to get out and we have to get up and fight for, because these things, the notion of what constitutes a freedom and a right is still a matter for debate in many cases.
Thank you. And I think it's such an important point there. And Mina Jack, if I can kind of bring you into this discussion, because similar to Olva, you've been involved in quite a few different kind of campaigns and that resulted in referenda as a route to try and change the law as well. And I wondered what your thoughts are on such democratic instruments like referenda. Obviously, Mina Jack and I had a really interesting long discussion earlier this week about this topic, because obviously myself coming from the UK, I know a little bit about referendum, shall we say. But I just wonder what your thoughts are about things such as referendums as democratic instruments in allowing a route to change the law, and if you think that they are really a way to address this and to allow citizens to express their point of view.
Thank you so much. It's hard to follow from Alva and all the other wonderful speakers. So as a bit of context, I worked as a campaign coordinator for BirdLife Malta in 2014 and 2015 on an abrogative referendum that was the first referendum called for by the people. More than 40,000 signatures were collected in Malta in order to have this referendum, in order to remove a law on spring hunting of turtle dove and quail, for which Malta was applying a derogation from the Birds Directive that is imposed by the European Union that bans hunting in spring on migratory species. And we lost. It was a very, very close vote. I mean, it was a very intense period. However, following campaigns around referendums has then sort of since become a bit of an obsession of mine. And so at the same time, concurrently, there was the referendum on equal marriage happening in Ireland, which I obviously followed as a queer person, was very important to me, and seeing that move in Ireland was fantastic. And then, of course, I know that referendum are used in various different ways in societies, but the experience of being an integral part of a campaign on a referendum here in Malta has made me look beyond just it as a tool, but how it's actually implied and how it's actually applied in the society. And so what we're talking about when we look at Malta, and so the very specific context I come from, is a society that has a lot of dichotomies, that there's a lot of, let's say we have a bipartisan system at the moment, where at the moment the Labour Party is in government, but the previous party that was in government was the Nationalist Party for 25 years. But it's like a Labour Party, Nationalist Party, Labour Party, Nationalist Party, which I know is very similar also for people listening from the UK or other countries. And this kind of dichotomy of also language. You're either Maltese speaker or an English speaker, and obviously majority of us are bilingual and can communicate effectively in both. But there's also a lot of, there's like these, I would say there are these conflict lines, right, in the society that are built in. And so when you, so when you're putting a referendum forward, obviously, then you're creating a new dichotomy, a yes or a no, that sometimes goes on top of already the fault lines that we have in society. And watching this film, right, I hear Alva talking about care, compassion, and change in the film, and that Ireland was ready to have that conversation. And then also this clip we saw, right, that the debate is happening not in the media, but it's happening in the street. And it makes me wonder for Malta whether, often I joke with my friends, Malta hasn't matured politically to have actually to have dialogues that do not fall back on whether you're red or blue. Often as a Green Party, we are seen really as the odd ones out. Honestly, I think it was much harder for some people to accept that I'm, a member of the Green Party, or that I was campaigning against spring hunting, which seemed like such a divisive issue, than to come out as gay. I've had more problem, more, let's say, harassment online related to my being from a small party, or from campaigning to stop spring hunting of birds, than I have had for being out as a queer person in Malta and visible in the media as a queer person as well. And so I think that says a lot of this kind of system where there's a key, a really acute sense of kinship to two major political parties that then influences everything else. So then when you do have a referendum, how can you ensure that it is that it's presented in a way that is independent from the political parties, and that the political parties are not imposing. And so what we saw when there was a referendum on spring hunting, which was a very, very particular case, a very fascinating case, because it was one of the organizations, behind the campaign was also the Green Party at the time. But then what happened is that, a referendum in Malta is meant to be called by the president, but the prime minister called the referendum. Now, the president is seen as a more neutral figure, but the prime minister is also there as the head of, well, it was Prime Minister Muscat, as the head of the Labour Party, was also seen in that way. And these kind of really subtle messages that are put on when such a system is applied kind of make you think like, oh, things are a bit rigged almost, and it becomes very complex. So sorry, I kind of went on a bit there, but I think that that idea of, well, listening, Ireland is ready, and I was like, that's fantastic, but I'm almost waiting, but not only, also working on when will Malta be ready, because I think a lot of healing has to happen as a state that is very much still in that post-colonial status, right? That there's a lot that we haven't talked about yet as a country that unites us, and rather instead there's just so much focus on what divides us, and therefore creating these layers of fault lines. So those are kind of my mixed thoughts. It's very nuanced for me. I love the thought of referendums, but then applied in certain contexts, I'm like, I start to get a bit of fear.
I know that fear very, very well. And I think it was really interesting, the point that you were raising about this idea of almost a political maturity, which I think really connects into the point Raphael was making earlier on about these things need to take time. These discussions need to happen. And Olva has already said, the situation in Ireland, it was the right moment to have that discussion. But, this didn't just happen overnight. It took a lot of time to do. And I'm sure I'll invite you to talk about this in a minute. But also I want to ask you, Olva, what do you think the role is of civil society in making this change? Because obviously you ran a campaign, and in a referendum as well. Referendums are usually built around campaigns that are outside of the norm of political parties, and there are usually specific campaigns kind of built around that. But do you think that civil society has been given, was it given a voice in this example? Was it given the chance to kind of lead the discussion? And what role do you think it played? And what importance should it have? Sorry, Olva, I think you've muted. Oh, there we go.
I was actually forcibly muted there. So let me say, first of all, about referendums. I mean, sometimes I look at the Irish Constitution and I think it's there as a great big obstacle to human rights and to freedom still, in many respects, actually. But I also think that a constitution, if it's not misused, as it is currently being, I think, in Hungary, or at least attempts are being made to misuse it, I think it can be a tremendous asset, because if you set out to make a major change, a major social change, socio-sexual change, whatever, and it isn't in the Constitution and needs to be put in, or there is something which you need to remove, as was the case for abortion, that you need to remove from the Constitution, you have a tremendous opportunity. You really do have an opportunity to create the space and to create the sense of need and motivation to have a real conversation about an issue which, in the case of both equal marriage for lesbians and gays and the case of abortion in the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, were topics which were not really up very much for public discussion. People really hadn't talked about them very much. And I think that having a referendum gives you that opportunity to create debate and to say, and the Irish people will say it, the people are sovereign when it comes to a referendum. This is not about taking political sides. This is not about political parties. It is we who decide. Now, that being said, there is no such thing as a complete freedom from politics anywhere. So political parties themselves take sides and become involved, and you have the ones who don't and the ones who do, and the yeses and the nos. The other difficulty, of course, with just to make a quick point about referendums, is that, and something that Mina really referred to there, they are very blunt instruments. They lend themselves, as you know, in relation to Brexit, to a yes or no answer. They do not lend themselves to the more nuanced kinds and more complex kinds of decision-making that do need to happen within our democracies, and that are then, in a way, handed over to the legislator to look after following the referendum. And the legislation happens, and in the case of abortion, for example, the legislation that we have is absolutely not fit for purpose, because it does not meet the needs of all women and pregnant people to access abortion in Ireland. So I make a distinction between gaining the right in principle in a referendum and then the more complex and nuanced work of legislating for that goes on afterwards. But I do think that in our case, with respect to both equal marriage and abortion, and it's no accident, by the way, that we got equal marriage first and then abortion, because that was seen as, I think, ultimately the much more difficult issue, and it was a much more difficult campaign, and I can tell you that from the inside. I think that what we really had to do in the first instance was convince the legislature that we needed to have a referendum. So referendums don't just get parachuted down out of the sky. It is civil society that is down there mobilizing, saying, if you don't let us have a referendum, we're not going to vote you into power, which is, of course, the ultimate power that civil society has, which is to say to the polis, if you do not accede to our demands, we will be out there outside the Dáil, our parliament, every day until you do. And I think that in both of those campaigns, we learned the huge and central importance of that physical presence of civil society in the form of protest, demand, and so on, as indeed has been seen in Poland. That has not yet paid dividends in Poland because, as everybody has said, these things take time. But that is the very moment, just when you think it is never going to change, whether it's in Malta or whether it's in Poland, and I say this to Mina with heartfelt wishes, that's the moment when you have to get out there again and to say we are never, ever going away until this is actually changed. And people said to me, and I'll end on this a bit long, I know, people said to me after we repealed the 8th Amendment, they said, God, that happened really fast, didn't it? And I'm saying, you're looking at my entire adult life, which has been spent on this issue and a few others as well. But you're looking at an adult's lifespan. I was, an older woman by the time we won it. So you just have to really keep pushing, and it isn't easy. But of course, those freedoms and that democracy that we constantly seek to expand and also have to defend, that is absolutely crucial to our lives, as we see in reverse from all those countries where it is either in jeopardy or where it is ultimately denied. And I think that that denial of freedom to human beings, whoever and wherever they are, to make our own decisions and choices within the societies that we live in, is a deep, acute cruelty.
Thank you, and I think that there's so many points I could respond to there, Alva. I think you've articulated them so well, and from my own experiences as well of the referendum as a blunt instrument, I often think it can also be the case that referenda are used to abdicate responsibility on behalf of particular governments, because then they could go, well, if the citizens make their mind up about it, we can't be blamed and we don't lose power as a result. So I felt obliged from my own experiences of such things to throw that into the discussion. So before we come to Mina Jack and to kind of move on to the next part of our discussion, I just want to show the next clip because I think this is a really nice point to show it. And apologies, Alva, you will be on screen and we are going to show you for this. But our final clip really shows what the impact is of changes to law to protect human rights, what the impact was of this campaign, and really tries to give a sense of what this actually meant. And I think this is a really positive moment from the film, and I know I certainly found it quite emotional to watch, and I'm sure everyone will find it emotional as we watch it now. So in this particular clip, we're going to hear the results of the referendum, and we're going to hear directly from Alva what this moment meant as the exit poll came in. So we're now going to watch the clip.
According to the exit poll, 68% voted yes and 32% have voted against it.
And I'm supposed to sound sensible when we've just had the most stunning victory in Irish history. I mean, how can anybody sound sensible? So this is quite stunning. Very glad to know that our daughters and our granddaughters and great-granddaughters will be okay.
Granny, we heard that you're a rebel girl and we're really proud of you.
I thought that was just so brilliant. She's been well trained by her mother, of course. But I'm also waiting for the final result. The hasn't gone up on the board yet. We don't know exactly what the percentage is. There is something really very, very cathartic. So the whole thing you had in the speech about making amends, which was the point I'd been making, some small amends for what happened in the past. I mean, that this is like a huge collective national moment of catharsis. Here we go. The three compañeras, right?
It's an extraordinary day for women. It's an extraordinary day for men. It is a remarkable day for the country as a whole. And I think we have in Ireland done ourselves proud. We have actually rewritten history, and we are creating an Ireland which values women, our bodies, our choices, ourselves, our lives, absolutely equally.
It's just such a moment of the film where I teared up. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried at that particular moment, because you could just feel that moment of release and that energy that you've got it over the line. And I think you following your story in the film, Alma, even though I already knew what the outcome was, I still really, you followed this narrative and still just want you to have achieved what you have campaigned for so long on. And I think it's such a gorgeous moment. And I'm sure all of my colleagues on the panel just express our enjoyment at seeing that moment in the film. So thank you so much. So we're now going to have a look at some of the questions that we've had coming in on the chat. And the first one that I want to raise has come in from Marta Villanova Bustos. So this question I'm going to ask to Mina Jack. So how can we support underrepresented groups to feel like they have a voice in a system that often feels impossible to change? So Mina Jack, I'll come to you first. If anyone else would like to answer in on this one as well, just let us know for our little secret chat channel that we have. So Mina Jack, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is a great question as someone from an underrepresented group in society, as a trans person. This speaks a lot to me. When I explain to young people in particular, to children in particular, who the Greens are, I talk about our Global Greens Charter and the principles. And my favorite principle out of all 6 is participatory democracy. And I like that because when the Greens talk about participatory democracy, we're not only talking about, a free electoral system in which everyone has a right to participate in, but we are also talking about other methods of active governorship that we can be a part of, so that citizens' voices are actively heard on matters that most relate to them. And I have a lot of issues with the current government in Malta, but something that happened in 2013 was really inspiring to me, in that they had set up, for instance, an LGBTQI consultative council to the government, where members of the community from NGOs, but also individual independent activists who were, trained on the matters, came together and discussed and drafted the laws that most impacted us. So it was the LGBT community in Malta who wrote our law on civil unions, and it was the LGBTQI community who wrote our law on gender identity, gender expressions, and sex characteristics. And therefore, it's no surprise that these laws are hailed actually as kind of models for what a law on legal gender recognition should look like. And so that kind of act of opening the door, right, from someone in power, though, is not always going to happen. We're not going to see that from everyone. Not all governments, not all ministers will be so benevolent as to invite you to the table and discuss on a matter that is of importance to you. And therefore, as Greens, I feel, and so that's what I'm taking the we to me in this question. I mean, as Greens, I feel like sometimes we leave this kind of idea of participatory democracy that is coded into our principles. Like, it's not one that we talk about as much. But as Greens, we need to be extremely active in any discussions on constitutional changes in our countries, in any matters related to voting rights and results of elections, for example, related to quotas and gender quotas, to ensure, for instance, that gender quotas are applied in a way that is actually representative of our country, or of the genders represented in a country, or also to push for such measures as consultative councils, and then, of course, to also take up, to use our voice and the little power that we have as recognized political parties in a country to actually speak up on issues of underrepresented groups, and to make room and sometimes to give up our space. So if we are invited to speak on a panel on refugee rights, and we realize that there's no refugee on the panel, then what can we do to ensure that a seat is added or that our time is split? I think this is like really important. We need to lead the way in this as Greens. Like it is fundamental. And so I'm looking at this, of course, as a sense of a green audience here. But to me, this is one of the most important ones, because as an LGBT person who's not been represented in laws until 2015, I can say it makes a big difference. It might not seem like much, but the fact that now I have an identity card that kind of, in a way, represents my gender means that if I am ridiculed or somehow, if I face any kind of backlash related to that, I can be like, oh, but my government recognizes me, so I don't need you to. It's in the law now, and I think that's really special. I hope that answers. I'm sure others can add to this.
It can. Thank you very much. And Oliver, I wonder if I could bring you on this question as well. So just to repeat it for you, how can we support underrepresented groups to feel like they have a voice in a system that often feels impossible to change?
Well, I think I agree very much with Mina that we all at every level need to move over and make space, and at times actually leave the stage. And I think that number one, and that also applies to our legislators. So we have to be very careful to make sure that we have democracies that become more, not less, representative. And I do have, I do have a problem with democracy in that regard, that it fails. It fails because we fail to make our democracies as representative as they should be. And I think that, just at the moment in Europe, it really behoves all of us to make sure that we have, from the point of view of gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity and ability/disability and age, and many other factors too. Social class hierarchies haven't disappeared, that we really do have to ask ourselves if we need to have positive action and quotas to achieve that. That's a solution which hasn't gone away either. And I do think this is a very important moment for it. And in the everyday, the action of going beyond yourself and your own comfort zone and saying, actually, I'm not going to do that, but I do know somebody else who could do it extremely well instead of me, and put them forward. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think there's so many different aspects that are really important to what you were saying about particularly knowing those moments when people need those platforms to be able to speak about those particular issues and to have those voices guide the debates and discussions. And I'm sure we could spend quite a lot of time talking about how various groups with protected characteristics are consistently being robbed of those platforms, and their existence is being debated without them being included in the debate. And I'm sure I don't need to tell many of you that is the case that's happening. So thank you for those really important reflections, Oliver. So we're now going to turn to a question that we have had in from Jenny Smith. So I'm just going to allow our team to bring this up. So referendums are fantastic, but only if you have an honest, educational, engaging campaign from the government. How can we ensure that governments conduct referendums in a meaningful way? And this is a question coming from the UK. And I think we've also had a comment from Gabriel in the chat that kind of follows on from this. So hopefully our tech team know which one I want to queue up for this one. So the comment that we've had from Gabriel is saying that we need an EU level same electoral rules, minimum signatures for supporting an independent or political party to get in a national parliament. So talking about potentially having as a solution to maybe connected to referendums or to EU rules, some kind of like models where signatures can be used to access and getting into votes. And Gabriel has left a whole variety of different comments that I'd urge you all to read in the chat to see his perspective on this. But I'm going to come to you, Raphael, first to answer Jenny's fundamental question of how can we ensure that governments conduct referendums in a meaningful way from your experience?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the experience because I'm German. And well, I don't want to sort of start a historical lecture, but we Germans have a particularly skeptical or historical reason not to have referendum. It's a long debate that, aren't we longer past the times of fascism that we can have, again, referenda in this country, but so far that's not a decision that has been taken. But I wanted to say two things about that. The first one would be, even if I'm talking here purely theoretically, it certainly is, I think, a rule of thumb that referendum shouldn't be called from above. A case, and I think sometimes it's a little bit too easy just to bash Hungary and Poland, but, for the last time here from my side, for example, Orban sort of suggested several times to call a referendum and then had a very leading question on how to deal with migration and just get a popular mandate for whatever sort of is supposed to be a hardline and national identity. So, that can't be the way. Of course, it can't also be just the way that somebody who's clamoring loudly, in all respect to kind of demonstration, that just, who shouts loudest gets the referendum. That obviously is also not the way to go, right? So there needs to be some form of moderation, and there it gets tricky. When is really the time to translate bottom-up mobilization into an actual political process that is responsible and not just fanning the flames of partisanship, as we also heard. So it is a very fine line. I don't think there is a cookbook recipe. And as a German, I'm cautious of the instrument, but I do think they do have a place. But the last thing, and I'm sorry if I'm a little bit maybe making a salt, like putting the salt, or I don't know, however you want to put it. We've said that the EU is there to defend also, and it's a very important tool for people in those countries to draw on European rights if they feel infringed in their own countries, and that they have this perspective to personally migrate or to kind of challenge things in the European courts. So all these things are extremely important. And yet we have to be honest that the EU is really not the best place to have referenda. I don't think there is any dancing around that. We have a so-called sort of citizen initiative with 1 million signature. It perhaps could be better used. It's not a big success so far, and the Commission could be more responsive to that. But yes, there is a trade-off, or there is at least a tension. I'm not saying it's impossible, but there is a tension between Switzerland, which has a lot of referenda, but decided not to join the European Union, and they have a lot of local referenda, and it's not the only one. One of the reasons why they didn't join the EU, and living in the European Union. And we have to live with this tension that we do actually have very distant institutions, and all respect to the European Parliament of trying to bridge that gap, but it is a challenge. So I think referenda can be, as we saw in the film, a powerful tool if there really is a big societal discussion behind it. But they should be, if they're used in moderation, and they should come from different angles, not just by shouting, or not just by sort of sending from above, no, let's have a referendum. So every country is different, and I think we need to work through that in every specific case.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on that, Raphael. And Gwendolyn, as our representative for the European Parliament, I wonder if you have any thoughts on what Raphael said, but also any general thoughts about this tool of democracy that is a referendum.
Yes, I think it has been said. I think a referendum is interesting as from the moment that it is done. I mean, the answers were in the questions. In the question, in fact, if it's done in a meaningful way with education and with organization. What we have seen is that in the case of Ireland, in the case of, because you said there's no referendum in Germany, it's true, but there's these citizen panels that have been put up by the region of Baden-Württemberg. And then what happened on the Convention for Climate in France is that in all these systems where you do involve citizens in a very meaningful way, not as a communication tool, really expecting citizens to get involved, giving them time to work on topics, giving them experts to listen to, giving them the possibility to do their own agenda and all of this, then you do bring up the best of the society. It doesn't mean that the debates are easy, but it means that people are working on good basis and in a sincere way. And then referendum become interesting. Indeed, the worst example is this is the referendum where the government decides a decision, gives all the info itself, never leaves anyone else giving info, and basically leads from the beginning the system. And then it only can create, in fact, it can be then very traumatizing. Of course, the English case is one, but there's a number of other cases in Europe where we see that it has left very divisive situations in the countries, because then people feel that they've been cheated and all this. But when referendum are done on this background of a lot of work before, in fact, and you take the time to do that work and you take the time to get citizens involved, then it becomes interesting. And I think this is a more democratic, general democratic thinking of things, because we need evolution of democracy. I think we have made the statement that what we call the representative democracy has been a bit stuck now, and then we need new evolution. They need participatory democracy, all sorts of systems that indeed implies everyone. We also need our democracies to be more inclusive, of course. I mean, having women to vote is not the only thing. We also indeed need to be now sure that everyone really participates. We also need representations to be more equal, of course. Until a representation is very white, very male, very 40-50, then democracy doesn't function very clearly. So we need democracy to also, this is why we are fighting more and more on quotas. They're not the miracle things, and they have their own problems, but indeed when we do think about how our democracy represents everyone, we need to find tools, and quotas are one of these tools. And it's very clear that everywhere where for example, the obligation of having women on list exists, it has brought women in parliaments. When you don't have this obligation, it has not brought women in politics. So that's quite a good example. And then I wanted to say that next to this evolution of democracy, which will help in situations where countries are a bit stuck, a bit frozen stage. I think it was interesting, Mina, what she said about Malta. That is also a big issue for European Parliament. It's my third country after Hungary and Poland, because in fact in Malta we do have huge problems of corruption and of a certain number of rights. Very paradoxal country. Anyway, I think that you cannot also not acknowledge the fact that there's also, dark forces. It is the case, and referendum will not always change that. And there you just have to be blunt and go with your ideas. On women rights, the lobbies that are working are so strong. They're putting a lot of money and energy. And there's been studies. One of my colleagues in Parliament, Heidi Otola from Finland, she asked researchers to do studies on this, and you can see very clearly how many lobbies are working against women's rights on the European Parliament level, on the Commission, Council, in every member state, and how they are really fighting in an everyday communication fight, and this is for women's rights, but it can be on LGBT rights and all this. So I mean, we shouldn't be naive. Also, you have also this to fight for. And I just wanted to add a last thing. We never said this during all this debate, but if we think about the film we were talking from at the beginning and what's happening in Poland and all this, the body of the woman still is such a place of fight, of political fight. It is still such a tool for conservative people, of course, to survey their society through the bodies of the woman, because when you control the bodies of the woman, you control the society, but also to fragilize half of the country, half of a population, and then exert power then. And that needs to be never forgotten, that bodies of the woman are still a huge place for democratic fight.
Thank you very much. So again, so many important points that were raised, particularly about the gendered aspects of this discussion and debate. And I'm now going to give the final word of tonight's discussion to Olva to kind of just reflect on some of the topics that we've raised and any final concluding thoughts that you have.
Well, I would have a lot of thoughts about it and they would probably go on for far too long, but let me just start with perhaps Gwendolyn's last point there. And I think that bodies, certainly bodies of women, gendered bodies, and also our sexed and sexualized bodies, our bodies that move, our migrant bodies, our bodies that are less able, the body is always so central, in fact, to the body politic, but so often gets controlled and overpowered and overwhelmed. And I think we always have to look so carefully at that. I mean, one of my great disappointments, I am a Europhile and have been since the get-go, but I am so disappointed that we still only have a non-binding resolution, for example, on abortion. It's such a simple issue. You have the European, the Parliament and the Commission calling for countries to ensure the access of women and pregnant people to abortion during COVID, when it would have been extremely relevant for Malta and also indeed for Ireland to ensure that people could travel for abortions. And we still only have that non-binding resolution. And I think that that is a kind of a measure of the extent to which our political structures remain so very deeply gendered and very averse to moving outside whatever is the sort of perceived traditional kind of comfort zone. And I think that's where civil society comes in, that we absolutely have to fight. Just a second brief point, and I promise you, Sam, I won't go on forever, but on referendums, I think the discussion about referendums has been really very interesting this evening. And like Mina, I am very interested in them. I have been through at least 8 at this stage in Ireland, 6 on abortion altogether, and 2 on divorce. We only got divorce in the mid-90s, and that was on the second referendum, and we only got it by a 0.003% or something. I think referendums are very important. Because we have a constitution, we can actually have them. However, they don't always bring you the result you want, and you have to know how to pick up the pieces afterwards. And they are also not the only tool in the book. There are many other ways. I personally thought that we could have got marriage equality without having a referendum. Not that I regret it, because it was an opportunity for a broad conversation about at least lesbian and gay people. But we got very good trans legislation without any kind of referendum. The legislation is good. The reality leaves still a lot to be desired on the ground. But I would say referendums, you have to be, as a campaigner, you have to be pretty sure from the get-go that you have a good chance of winning, because if you lose, it really, really, really is tough. And the second point specifically about referendums is that in Ireland, for both the equality, the equal marriage and the abortion referendums, we had a citizens' assembly, which was the first time pretty well that had been done in the modern era in Ireland. And they were very successful. And as examples of effective participatory democracy, they really worked very well. I was extremely skeptical of the one for the repeal of the 8th Amendment, because I thought it was the government trying to let itself off the hook and to hide behind smoke and masks and one thing and another. And I think it probably was that. The point is that the people had a great conversation, 199 of them, in public, live streamed, and said everything that we needed them to say. So I thought that they were both very interesting exercises, and I would certainly like to see far more of them. We've had a couple since then, and I think that is a very productive way of going forward. But ultimately, if there is a referendum, government should keep out. Our government is the only one that can call a referendum. But having called it, they should then leave it to a citizens' assembly to formulate the question, to go back to Raphael's point at the beginning. And I think that we should not see referendums as the panacea to all our ills. We definitely shouldn't. We do still have elections, and we should mobilize to elect people who will actually defend our democracy and who will expand and develop our understanding of what freedom is and who is still excluded. I have to say, I've really enjoyed this discussion this evening. Such interesting questions too. I wish we could go on, all of us, and have sort of real conversation as well.
Wonderful. I think there's a very clear message there for any governments listening tonight. Stay out of those referendums. It's not your business to set the question, make them happen. I think that's a really, really important point. So a huge thank you tonight to our panelists, to Alva, to Gwendolyn, to Mina, Jack, and to Raphael. Thank you so much for your contributions in today's discussion. And of course, today the conversation is only starting. I think all of you are on Twitter in some shape or form or social media, so you can follow our speakers there. And please remember, you can still watch our film, The 8th, this evening. So you can grab your popcorn. I've got my specially designed green screen popcorn box. But make sure that you get the popcorn on. I'm going to put it on after this and watch this film again because it's so amazing. And share with us your thoughts via the European Green Party Twitter account, the Facebook, the Instagram. Let's keep this conversation going. Today is only the start. And we are going to be back next month, as Mar said, on the 3rd Thursday of the month. And we're going to be exploring the topic of building green futures together. And we're going to be announcing a very special film for this as well. So set your social media alerts. Follow EGP accounts. And the green screen even has its own Instagram now. So set your alerts and get ready for it. So thank you to our panel. A big thank you to all the team who you don't see behind the scenes, who help us pull things together and make magic happen on our screens. And also thank you to all of you for coming and watching and engaging with the debate. We've had so many wonderful comments, so many people from across Europe and indeed the world listening tonight. So I will see you next time for next month's film. And until then, stay safe and stay healthy. Good night, and thank you very much.